The knock echoed through the long hallway of Jefferson Middle School on a Monday morning. The classroom was frozen, the air still heavy from the cruel words shouted just moments earlier. "Don't hang out with her, she doesn't even have parents." Laughter had rippled through the room like knives cutting into skin. Emily, 12 years old, sat hunched in her chair, biting her lip until it nearly bled. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. The door creaked open. Standing there was a man in a faded military uniform, his cap shadowing a weathered face carved by years of sun and sand. His voice was gravelly but firm. "Excuse me," he said, his eyes sweeping the room before fixing on Emily. "I'm here. For my daughter, Emily." The room went silent, not a single laugh. Dozens of eyes shifted from the stranger to the trembling girl in the corner. Emily's chest tightened. She could barely breathe. Emily Miller's world had always been made up of fragments of answers, unfinished stories and shadows of people who were no longer there. Her grandparents loved her, yes, but love sometimes wasn't enough to shield a child from the curious eyes and sharp tongues of other children. By the time she turned 12, Emily had learned to live in silence. Like a ghost floating through the halls of Jefferson Middle School, she walked to school each morning with her head bowed. The straps of her faded backpack digging into her shoulders. The sidewalk cracks were easier to look at than the stares of classmates who lingered at the bus stop. She didn't ride the bus. She preferred to walk alone. On the bus, the questions came too quickly. "Why don't your parents ever come to conferences? Where's your mom? Where's your dad?" Questions Emily didn't know how to answer. At home, her grandmother would smooth down Emily's hair and remind her, "You're strong, just like your father." But the words felt empty because Emily had never truly seen the man she was compared to. She remembered faint images, a pair of arms lifting her up, a voice humming low, but they were so fragile, she wasn't sure if those memories were real or just dreams stitched together from longing. Her mother's absence was harder to ignore. Emily knew her mother had died when she was very small, though the details were always glossed over. A sickness, her grandparents had said. No specifics, no photographs left on the walls. It was as if grief itself had erased her mother's presence from the house, but the question of her father lingered like a thorn. When Emily was 6, she asked directly, "Grandma, where's my dad?" Her grandmother's lips had pressed into a thin line. It's not here right now, sweetheart. When will he come back?" There had been no answer. Only the sound of the old clock ticking in the kitchen. From that day forward, Emily stopped asking. At school, however, her classmates never stopped. Children have a way of sniffing out the difference in others, of finding the weakest seam to pull until it splits. By 5th grade, rumors bloomed like weeds. Her dad's in jail. One boy whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "No, he ran away. My mom said so." "Doesn't matter," a girl added, smirking. "She doesn't have anybody. She's just nobody." The words clung to Emily's skin like burrs. She tried ignoring them, but each one burrowed deeper, filling her chest with a heaviness she couldn't name. Her only refuge was the art room. There, in the quiet corner by the window, she drew scenes that didn't exist, forests lit by golden sunlight, oceans that stretched endlessly, families holding hands. In her drawings, fathers always stood tall, smiling down at their children. Mothers had soft eyes and warm arms. On paper, she could create what reality denied her. Her art teacher, Mrs. Harper, noticed the consistency of these drawings. One afternoon, as Emily gathered her pencils, Mrs. Harper gently asked, "Emily, why do you always draw families?" Emily hesitated, staring at the sketch of a tall man carrying a little girl on his shoulders. "Because it feels safe," she whispered. Mrs. Harper wanted to ask more, but she saw the way Emily's shoulders tightened, like a door shutting. So she simply nodded, placed a hand on the girl's, and said, "Keep drawing. Sometimes art tells the stories we can't say out loud." At home, her grandparents tried their best. Her grandfather, a quiet man who had worked as a mechanic his whole life, told her bedtime stories about machines that could fly to the moon and back. Her grandmother baked pies and knitted scarves, wrapping Emily in comfort when words weren't enough. But the gaps remained. Emily sometimes lay awake at night, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, wondering if her father thought of her. Did he know the color of her eyes? Did he remember her laugh? Did he ever imagine what her birthday cake looked like each year? She wanted to believe he did. She wanted to believe he was out there somewhere, and that one day he would walk through the door and make the whispers at school vanish. But years passed, and no one came. By the time Emily entered middle school, the taunts had grown harsher. Older kids called her orphan or ghost girl. They snatched her notebooks, leafed through her drawings, and laughed. Sometimes they crumpled the sketches into balls and tossed them across the classroom like trash. Emily swallowed the anger, the hurt, and pressed it down until it settled deep in her chest. She never fought back. Fighting would only prove them right that she was different, unwanted, unprotected. Instead, she perfected invisibility. She sat in the back row, spoke only when called upon, and slipped away as soon as the bell rang. Her teachers noticed the quietness, but in a school buzzing with dozens of loud, demanding children, silence often went unnoticed. Still, every so often, someone would see her. Mrs. Harper, a librarian who set aside books she thought Emily would. Like, even her grandmother, who sometimes caught Emily staring out the window and whispered, "He'll come back one day." But hope is a fragile thing. Each year that passed chipped away at it, till Emily wasn't sure she believed anymore. The day before the knock on the classroom door, Emily had sat in the cafeteria, eating alone as usual. She doodled in the margins of her math homework, sketching the outline of a soldier holding a child's hand. She didn't even realize she was doing it until one of the boys at her table leaned over. "Why do you always draw soldiers? Your dad's not a soldier. He's probably a bum somewhere." Laughter followed, sharp and cruel. Emily's throat tightened, but she forced herself to look away, racing the drawing until the page tore. That night, she cried into her pillow, muffling the sound so her grandparents wouldn't hear. She hated herself for crying. She hated them for being right. And yet, somewhere in the deepest part of her, a small voice whispered, "What if they're wrong? What if he really is out there?" The next morning dawned cold and gray. Emily walked to school with her scarf pulled tight, shoulders hunched against the biting wind. She felt the weight of another day pressing on her. Another day of whispers, of laughter, of being nobody. But fate had been shifting quietly in the background, preparing to collide with her life in a way she couldn't have imagined. Because at that very hour, hundreds of miles away, a man in a weathered uniform was driving an old pickup truck toward Jefferson. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, a crumpled photograph resting on the dashboard. His eyes burned with fear and hope in equal measure. He was coming home. John Miller had never imagined he would become a ghost in his daughter's life. When Emily was born, he held her in his arms in the sterile light of the hospital room, whispering promises to a tiny bundle of flesh and breath. Her mother, Lily, lay exhausted but radiant, her smile weak but unbreakable as she watched them. For John, that moment was the first time he truly understood love, the kind that carves itself into your soul and reshapes who you are. He had been a Marine for nearly a decade, his life defined by the rigid rhythms of duty, discipline, and sacrifice. But with Emily's birth, he felt something new, a tether pulling him homeward. He wanted to be more than a soldier. He wanted to be a father. Yet life had other plans. When Lily fell ill 2 years later, John fought the hardest battle of his life, not in a desert halfway across the world, but in hospital corridors that smelled of antiseptic and despair. The doctors spoke in measured tones, words like cancer and inoperable and palliative care. John stayed by Lily's side every night he could, holding her hand as Emily, too young to understand, slept curled in a chair beside the bed. And then one morning, the monitors went flat. John kissed his wife's cooling forehead, tears soaking his uniform. Lily was gone, and he was left with a toddler who looked at him with Lily's eyes and asked why Mommy wouldn't wake up. For months afterward, John lived in two worlds, fatherhood and duty. He changed diapers, sang lullabies, packed little lunches and… Then, when the orders came, he donned his uniform again. The Marines needed him. War was escalating overseas. He tried to decline deployment, but refusal wasn't an option. "You'll be back before you know it," his commanding officer had said. "It's just another tour." He kissed Emily goodbye, pressed her tiny hand to his lips, and whispered, "I'll come home soon, baby girl." Soon turned into years. The Middle East was a furnace of sand and fire, an endless horizon where danger lurked behind every dune, every doorway. John carried Emily's photograph in his chest pocket, laminated to withstand sweat and rain. In it, she was 3 years old, perched on his knee, smiling with her baby teeth. He looked at that photo every night, a ritual before he closed his eyes, whispering goodnight to a daughter thousands of miles away. Letters became his lifeline. Whenever the base allowed, he wrote pages of stories, promises, and silly doodles telling Emily about the stars he saw at night or the camel he glimpsed on patrol. He told her he loved her 1,000 times, filling the margins with hearts and stick. Figures of the two of them together, but war swallows mail, like the desert swallows footprints. Some letters arrived, many never did. He never knew which words made it to her, which promises survived the journey across oceans. One night, everything changed. The convoy was supposed to be routine. Supply run through a stretch of road they'd traveled dozens of times. John sat in the lead vehicle, alert but steady, his rifle cradled across his chest. The desert was quiet, too quiet, and in that silence came the explosion. The world erupted into fire and shrapnel. Metal screamed as the Humvee flipped onto its side. John was thrown against the door, pain searing through his ribs as smoke filled his lungs. He remembered the sound of his men shouting, the sting of sand and blood, and then dashed darkness. When he awoke in a military hospital, tubes snaked from his body. His right leg was bandaged, his side stitched, and his breathing ragged. Doctors told him he was lucky. 2 of his comrades hadn't made it. The guilt pressed heavier than the weight of his injuries. He stayed there for months, recovering in fragments. Each step on crutches was agony, but he kept pushing, driven by a single thought: Emily, my girl needs me. But military bureaucracy is a labyrinth. His discharge was delayed, his communications limited. Letters written from the hospital vanished into the system. Asked about his family constantly, but the answers were vague, delayed, or lost in paperwork. By the time he was stable enough to be released, years had slipped through his fingers. When John finally returned stateside, limping but alive, he expected reunion. Instead, he was met with silence. His parents had passed away while he was overseas. Friends had scattered across the country. He'd searched for Emily, but records showed her living with her maternal grandparents in Jefferson. He tried sending letters there, but again no reply. At first, he thought it was a mistake. Maybe the mail was slow. Maybe her grandparents didn't want to confuse her. But as time stretched, doubt began to gnaw at him. Did Emily even know he was alive? Did she believe he had abandoned her? That thought haunted him more than any battlefield memory. He had fought wars for his country. The real war, the one for his daughter's love, was slipping through his grasp. John took odd jobs while he healed. Mechanic work, security details, anything that paid enough to keep him afloat while he searched. He carried her photograph everywhere, worn now to the point of fading. Every night, he whispered the same words: "I'll find you. Emily, I swear I will." Years passed, and he became a stranger in his own homeland. People saw a limping veteran in a worn uniform, not the father desperate to reclaim what he had lost. He faced nights of loneliness, days of frustration, but through it all, he clung to hope. And then, at last, through a former Marine buddy who still lived near Jefferson, he found the lead he needed. Emily Miller, 12 years old, attending Jefferson Middle School. John's heart thundered in his chest when he heard it. She was alive. She was within reach. The morning he set out for Jefferson, John sat behind the wheel of his rusted pickup. The photo of Emily taped to the dashboard. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he whispered, "It's time, baby girl. Daddy's coming." He didn't know what he would find. He didn't know if she would recognize him or if she would turn away in anger. But the years of distance, of silence, had not broken the bond he felt. For every mile closer, the hope grew stronger. The war had taken years from him, stolen moments he could never recover, but it had not taken his love. And now he was ready to fight the hardest battle of all, to prove to his daughter that he had never abandoned her. Emily Miller had always felt like the empty chair at a dinner table. She was there, present, but incomplete, something missing that everyone else could see, even if she tried to hide it. At 12, she had already learned that children could be crueler than any battlefield her father had known. Though she didn't yet realize her father was fighting his own battles halfway across the world, the day began the way most days did. Emily walked the long stretch of cracked sidewalk leading to Jefferson Middle School, the weight of her backpack digging into her thin shoulders. She liked walking because it gave her time to prepare, to put on the invisible armor she needed to face the day. The sound of gravel under her sneakers was steady, almost comforting. But her stomach always tightened when the school's brick walls came into view. Inside,
always buzzed
with the shrill chatter of kids swapping jokes and weekend stories. Emily kept her head down, hoping to blend into the crowd. But blending in had never been her gift. Her clothes, hand-me-downs from older cousins, didn't match the brand-new sneakers or glittering backpacks the other girls flaunted. Her hair, always tied back in a practical braid by her grandmother, never curled or shimmered like theirs. Above all, there was the one fact no accessory could hide. She never had a parent waiting for her at school. It started with whispers. "In the cafeteria? Where's your mom?" someone had asked once, loud enough for others to hear. "She doesn't have one," another answered before Emily could speak, giggling, and her dad probably ran off. "My mom said kids like that, you know, they're trouble." The whispers had spread like wildfire, and soon the names followed. Orphan, ghost girl, nobody. Emily stopped eating in the cafeteria whenever she could. She packed her lunch, small sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and slipped into the library, where the silence at least didn't hurt. She sat at a corner table, chewing quietly as she lost herself in books. Books were safe. In books, families were complicated, yes, but they always seemed to come together in the end. Heroes had parents who believed in them, or, if they didn't, they found mentors who guided them. Emily longed for that, for someone to stand tall beside her and say, "She's mine, leave her alone." But day after day, no one came. One afternoon, during gym class, Emily stood alone by the bleachers as teams were chosen for basketball. Names were called one after another, children rushing forward, high-fiving their friends. Emily's name never came. She remained in the shrinking pool of unwanted players until the coach sighed and assigned her to a team by default. The boy captain of that team groaned, "Do we have to take her? She can't even shoot." Laughter erupted. Emily's face burned, but she said nothing. She picked up the ball when it rolled her way, dribbled awkwardly, and missed the basket by several feet. The laughter grew louder. Later, in the locker room, she overheard the same boys talking. Maybe if her dad showed up to practice, she'd know how to play. Her dad's gone, dude. That's why she's so weird. The words stung worse than any scraped knee. Emily kept her back to them, tying her shoelaces with trembling hands, willing herself not to cry. She had learned long ago that tears only gave bullies more power. Her only refuge was her sketchbook. After homework was done, after her grandparents had gone to bed, Emily would crawl beneath her blanket with a flashlight and draw. The images spilled from her pencil in the quiet of the night, forests with sunlight streaming through, families gathered around tables, children riding on their father's shoulders. Sometimes she drew soldiers. She didn't know why, not really. Perhaps it was the faint, blurry memory of a uniform from her earliest years, or perhaps it was just her imagination stitching together scraps of hope. But in her drawings, the soldiers always came home. They carried their daughters in strong arms, placed medals in their tiny hands, and promised never to leave again. Those sketches were her secret. They lived between the pages of her notebook, hidden from the eyes that judged her so harshly during the day. Only in those pages could she build a world where she wasn't alone. At home, her grandparents tried to fill the gaps. Her grandmother, Cooked hearty meals, chicken pot pie, and warm cornbread, filling the kitchen with smells that reminded Emily of safety. Her grandfather, though quieter, sometimes sat beside her and told stories of machines he had repaired in his younger days. They loved her, she knew. But love from the elderly carried a fragility, a gentleness that couldn't quite stand up to the cruelty of the outside world. Sometimes, late at night, Emily caught her grandmother looking at an old box tucked on the dossier top shelf of the closet. When she asked what was inside, her grandmother only shook her head. Memories, dear. Things that hurt too much to touch. Emily wondered if the box held photographs of her father, but she never pressed. Eyes always filled with tears at the question, so she carried her questions in silence. Her loneliness wasn't just emotional, it was physical. Every parent-teacher conference, every school concert, every sports game ended the same way. Emily standing alone while other children ran into the arms of mothers, fathers who clapped proudly and handed them flowers at her. Last recital, she had played the flute as best she could, her small hands trembling with nerves. When the curtain closed, she scanned the crowd instinctively, as though by some miracle someone would be there for her. But only her grandparents, frail and slow, clapped from the back row. The rest of the audience filtered out, children rushing into embraces, laughter echoing off the walls. Emily smiled weakly at her grandparents, but deep inside, something ached. She wanted to know, needed that moment. The moment when someone strong, someone who looked like her, would kneel down and say, "That's my girl." But that moment never came. And yet, despite it all, Emily carried a quiet strength. She woke up each morning and walked into school knowing what waited for her. She endured the whispers, the laughter, the stares. She turned her pain into drawings, into quiet determination. Hope still flickered inside her, even if it was faint. At night, as she drifted to sleep, she sometimes whispered into the darkness, "Daddy, if you're out there, please come back." She didn't know if anyone heard, but somewhere hundreds of miles away, a man did. The morning air in Jefferson was crisp, the kind that burned the lungs slightly and smelled faintly of damp leaves. John Miller tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his rusted pickup truck, the engine groaning as though reluctant to make the journey. He had been on countless missions, faced down enemy fire, survived explosions and ambushes, but nothing had ever made his hands tremble the way they did now. On the passenger seat sat the photograph, the one constant that had traveled with him. Across deserts and through hospitals. A little girl with round cheeks and bright eyes perched on his knee, laughing at something just out of frame. She had been 3 years old then, now she was 12. Would she even recognize me? He thought. The face in the mirror these days looked nothing like the man in the photograph. His jaw was lined with scars, his hair streaked with gray, and a limp marked every step he took. He was a soldier worn thin, not the young father who had once swung. His daughter in circles in the backyard. And worse, what if she hated him? The thought coiled like barbed wire in his chest. He had been gone too long, too many birthdays missed, too many unanswered questions. Perhaps she believed he had chosen war over her, that he had abandoned her. The idea nearly made him turn the truck around. But then he glanced at the photo again, and the memory of his promise whispered back to him, "I'll come home to you, Emily, no matter what." He pressed harder on the gas. By the time he reached Jefferson Middle School, the morning bell had already rung. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few staff cars and bicycles locked to racks. John parked at the far end, as if distance could give him a moment to gather himself. He adjusted his uniform jacket, smoothed his hair under the cap, and took a deep breath. His limp was more pronounced on the cracked pavement. Every step toward the school doors echoed in his mind like a countdown. Inside, the corridors stretched long and unfamiliar, filled with the muffled sounds of children's voices. Behind classroom doors, a secretary at the front office looked up, startled at the sight of a man in uniform. "Can I help you?" she asked hesitantly. "Yes, ma'am," John said, his voice rough. "I'm looking for my daughter, Emily Miller. She's in 7th grade." The secretary blinked, confused. But something in his tone, or maybe the intensity of his eyes, stopped her from questioning. She gestured vaguely down the hall. Room 214. Second floor. John nodded his thanks, heart hammering louder with each uneven step up the stairs. His boots clacked against the linoleum. He reached the door marked 214 just as laughter erupted. Inside, it wasn't the laughter of joy, but sharp and cutting. He froze, his hand hovering near the doorknob. He heard a boy's voice sneer. "Don't hang out with Hirsch. She doesn't even have parents." More laughter followed. John's stomach dropped. He didn't need to guess who her was. His hand clenched into a fist, then loosened. He took a breath, straightened his back, despite the pain in his leg, and knocked. The laughter cut off instantly. From Emily's perspective, the knock was like thunder. Her cheeks burned from the insult, her fingernails digging into her palm under the desk. She wanted to vanish, to disappear into the floor. The last thing she expected was the sound of knuckles rapping firmly against the classroom door. Her teacher, startled, moved to open it. And then there he was. A man in a worn military uniform stood framed in the doorway. His presence seemed to fill the entire room. His face was weathered, lined with years and sorrow, but his eyes, those eyes were piercing, familiar in a way that made Emily's breath catch in her throat. The room went silent. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice gravelly but steady. He scanned the room until his gaze locked on Emily. "I'm here for my daughter, Emily." Every head turned. The silence was so thick it pressed against her ears. Emily's heart pounded, her vision blurring as though the world had tilted sideways. "Daughter," he had said, "daughter." John's knees nearly buckled when he saw her. She was taller now, of course, no longer the baby he remembered. Her braid was neat, her face pale with shock. But her eyes were lilies. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. His voice cracked. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. "Emily." Teacher's hand flew to her mouth. Some of the children gasped, others stared, guilt already flickering in their eyes. The boy who had taunted her shrank back into his chair, suddenly very small, that Emily wanted to run. Part of her wanted to leap into his arms. Another part screamed that this couldn't be real. For years, she had convinced herself that her father was gone, that he didn't want her. And now here he was. She shook her head slightly, tears burning. No, you can't be." But John reached into his jacket and pulled out the photograph. The same one she had drawn again and again in her sketchbook without realizing. A soldier holding a toddler, smiling at her with such pride it hurt to look at. "This is you," John whispered, his hand trembling as he held it out. "And this is me. I never stopped loving you. Not for one day." The dam inside her broke. Emily pushed back her chair and stumbled forward, the room a blur of desks and faces. She stood frozen for a heartbeat in front of him, staring at the photograph, then at his scarred face. The tears came hot and fast. "You came back," she whispered. John dropped to one knee despite the ache in his leg and gathered her into his arms. For the first time in nearly a decade, father and daughter held each other again, sobbing openly in front of an entire classroom too stunned to speak. From the back of the room, a girl began to cry softly. Soon, others followed. Even the teacher wiped at her eyes. The cruel laughter that had filled the room minutes before was gone, replaced by something else: shame, awe, and the raw power of truth. John held his daughter as though letting go would mean losing her all over again. Emily clung to him, the warmth of his embrace melting years of loneliness. No one moved for a long time. The room was still trembling with the weight of silence. Emily clung to her father as if he might vanish if she let go, while John pressed his cheek against her hair, whispering, "I'm here now. I've got you." His uniform smelled faintly of dust and leather, his hands rough and scarred, but to Emily, it felt like the safest place in the world. Her classmates, who just moments before had laughed at her, now stared with wide eyes, unable to process what they were seeing. The teacher, Mrs. Carter, blinked rapidly, as if trying to hold back tears. Finally, She cleared her throat and spoke softly. "Mr. Miller, maybe you should. Perhaps you could explain." John lifted his head. His eyes swept across the room, meeting the faces of the children, some guilty, some curious, all silent. He could feel Emily trembling against him, and he knew the moment had come. He had not just come back for her, he had to set the record straight. He pulled the photograph from his pocket again and held it up so everyone could see. The edges were worn, the colors faded, but the image was unmistakable. A young Marine smiling proudly with a little girl perched on his knee. "This," John said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "is my daughter, Emily." Gasps rippled through the room. Even those who had doubted only minutes before now saw the truth in the resemblance. The same eyes, the same smile. John swallowed hard. Was there when she was born. Was there when her mother, my wife, passed away. I held her in my arms and promised her I would never abandon her. His voice cracked, but he pushed on. He told them everything. How he had been deployed overseas when Emily was just a toddler. How war had swallowed years of his life, keeping him far from home. How letters he had written by flashlight in the desert never reached her, carried away by the chaos of conflict. He described the explosion. The months spent in a hospital bed with broken bones and shattered ribs, fighting to recover so he could return to her. He spoke of the bureaucracy, the silence, the endless frustration of trying to reach his daughter and never receiving an answer. "I was alive," he said, his voice breaking. "I never stopped thinking of her. Not for one day. Home, the world had moved on without me. I thought she must believe I'd abandoned her. And that," his jaw tightened, "that broke me more than any bullet ever could." Emily's chest heaved as she listened, her tears falling freely now. For years she had lived with the gnawing ache of absence, the whispered rumors that her father had left because he didn't care. But now, hearing him, she understood the truth. He had been fighting, not just for his country, but for the chance to come back to her. She squeezed his hand, whispering through her sobs, I knew you had to be out there." The classroom shifted. The children who had mocked her looked down at their desks, shame burning their cheeks. The boy who had sneered at her that morning fidgeted with his pencil, unable to meet her eyes. For the first time, they saw Emily not as the orphan girl, but as the daughter of a man who had endured more than they could fathom. Mrs. Carter wiped her eyes openly now. "Mr. Miller," she said gently, "I think the whole school needs to hear this." And so, an hour later, the principal arranged a special assembly in the auditorium. Word spread quickly by the time Emily and her father walked in, escorted by Mrs. Carter. The seats were filled with students, teachers, and staff. Murmurs rippled through the crowd at the sight of the man in uniform limping beside the girl no one had ever seen with a parent before. On the stage, John took the microphone, his hand trembling slightly as Emily stood beside him. He looked out over the sea of young faces and drew a breath. A soldier can lose everything. He began, his voice carrying through the auditorium. "Home, friends, even health. But there's one thing I never lost." He looked down at Emily, then back at the crowd. "My love for my daughter." The room was silent. So silent that every word seemed to carve itself into the air. I know many of you have fathers who come home every night. Fathers who cheer at your games, who tuck you into bed. I wish I could have been that father for Emily. But duty took me away. When I tried to come back, life and circumstance kept me from her. He paused, his throat tight. "I don't tell you this for pity. I tell you because I want you to understand what it means when you laugh at someone for what they've lost. Every cruel word you've spoken to her was a weight she carried alone, and she carried it bravely." John's voice grew firmer. "She is not a girl with no parents. She is my daughter. She is stronger than you will ever know." The effect was seismic. Students in the audience shifted uncomfortably, realizing how many times they had whispered, mocked, excluded. Some wiped at their eyes, moved not only by his story, but by the raw devotion in his voice. Emily, standing beside her father, felt taller than she ever had in her life. For once, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't a ghost. Of a soldier who had walked through fire to find her again. When John finished, the room erupted in applause, first hesitant, then overwhelming, echoing off the auditorium walls. Teachers stood, students clapped until their hands stung. Some even cried openly, including those who had once made Emily cry. Emily turned to her father, her heart swelling with pride and relief. He looked back at her, eyes glistening, and mouthed the words, "I kept my promise." After the assembly, students approached Emily quietly, awkwardly. A girl who had once teased her offered a soft, "I'm sorry." A boy handed her a folded note with the words, "Your dad's amazing." For the first time in her life, Emily didn't walk alone down the hallway. She walked beside her father, who limped proudly, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, and Emily knew, deep in her heart, that everything had changed. The days that followed the assembly at Jefferson Middle School felt almost unreal to Emily. For years she had been the girl no one noticed, or worse, the one they noticed only to whisper about behind her back. But suddenly her name carried a different weight. When she walked down the hallway, children who once looked past her now stopped to smile or nod. Some of them muttered awkward apologies, while others simply gave her space, letting her move without the shadows of their cruelty. Trailing after her, it wasn't just the students who had changed. Teachers who had once pitied her quietly now greeted her with warmth. Mrs. Harper, her art teacher, pulled her aside one afternoon, tears shining in her eyes. "I knew there was something powerful in your drawing," she said, squeezing Emily's shoulder. "Now I understand. You've been carrying the weight of hope this whole time." Emily didn't know what to say. She only smiled faintly and clutched the sketchbook that had once been her only refuge. It was no longer just filled with lonely dreams. Now she had real memories to sketch. A father's smile, scarred hands that held hers. The look of pride that had once lived only in her imagination, now made flesh and bone. John, too, found himself adjusting to a new rhythm. After years of displacement, of living as a soldier first and a father second, he was learning what it meant to be present. Each morning, he woke early out of habit, his body still attuned to the rigid schedule of the military. But instead of preparing for patrol, he brewed coffee in the small kitchen of his in-laws' house and made sure Emily had breakfast before school. He walked her to the gates, limping but steady, his uniform jacket exchanged for a plain work coat. He became a fixture there, leaning against the fence with quiet pride. Some of the other parents eyed him with curiosity at first. They had heard the story who in town hadn't by now, and whispers traveled fast, but respect grew quickly. John's presence was unmistakable, a reminder of sacrifice, resilience, and above all, love. At home he worked to rebuild not just a routine, but a relationship. He and Emily spent long evenings at the kitchen table, piecing together the years they had lost. Emily asked about her mother, about the way she used to laugh, the songs she sang when cooking. John shared stories he had kept locked away, his voice trembling but steady. "She loved you fiercely," he told Emily one night, pulling an old locket from his pocket. Inside was a tiny picture of Lily, smiling softly. "She made me promise, when she got sick, that I'd protect you, that I'd make sure you knew you were loved." Emily traced the edge of the locket with her finger, her throat tight. For so long, she had felt abandoned by both parents, one lost to death, the other to absence. But now, with the weight of the locket in her palm and her father sitting across from her, she finally felt whole. Still, it wasn't easy. The years had carved deep scars, some visible, some not. John carried guilt like a second skin. At night, Emily sometimes heard him pacing in the living room, his limp uneven against the wooden floor. When she peeked through the door, she saw him staring at the faded photograph, his jaw clenched, his shoulders tense. "Are you okay?" she asked once, her small voice breaking the silence. He turned, startled, then forced a smile. "Just thinking, baby girl, just thinking." But she knew. She knew the weight of war would never fully leave him, just as the weight of loneliness would never fully leave her. What mattered was that they bore those weights together now, not alone. The town itself embraced their story in unexpected ways. The local newspaper ran an article titled "A Soldier's Promise," featuring a picture of John and Emily outside the school. Strangers approached them at the grocery store, shaking John's hand, thanking him for his service, and telling Emily how lucky she was. Emily didn't like the attention at first. It felt overwhelming, like she was suddenly on display. But she saw how her father stood taller when people recognized him. Not for his scars or his limp, but for his devotion. And slowly, she began to feel proud too. Proud to walk beside him, to say the words she had longed to say for years. This is my dad. One Saturday afternoon, John took Emily to the park where he had once played as a boy. The playground was crowded with families, laughter ringing out as children swung and slid and shouted. For a moment, Emily felt a pang of envy. This was the kind of childhood she had missed. But then John knelt beside her. Lowering himself carefully despite the ache in his knee, he held out his hand. "Want to try the swings?" he asked with a small smile. Emily laughed nervously. "Dad, I'm 12. He teased, maybe a little. "Then humor me," he said. "I missed too many years. Let me have this one." So she sat on the swing, and he pushed her gently, the chains creaking as she rose higher. Her laughter bubbled out, unguarded and free. John laughed too, the sound rough but genuine, echoing across the park. For the first time, Emily felt what she had drawn all those nights in her sketchbook. Father's presence, steady and strong, lifting her up. The seasons shifted. Winter snow blanketed Jefferson, and John built fires in the fireplace, while Emily read aloud from her favorite books. Spring came, and they planted a small garden together in her grandparents' yard. With each passing month, the gap between them narrowed, not erased, but bridged by moments of tenderness and trust. One evening in late spring, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily and John sat on the porch steps, the world washed in orange and pink. She leaned her head against his arm, and he draped an arm around her shoulders. "Do you ever wish things had been different?" she asked softly. John was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "Every single day. I wish I could have been here for every birthday, every recital, every scraped knee. But wishing won't change the past." He kissed the top of her head. "What I can do is be here now. I promise you, Emily, I'm not going anywhere again." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't from sadness. She nodded against his arm, whispering, "That's all I ever wanted." The promise that had carried John through battlefields, hospitals, and years of silence was finally fulfilled. He was home, not just in a town, not just in a house, but in the heart of the daughter who had waited for him. Emily no longer walked with her head down. She no longer hid in the library at lunch or sketched families only in secret. She walked with confidence, her father's steady presence behind her. And when people looked at her now, they saw not a ghost, but a girl loved fiercely. A girl who had been found. The soldier had come back. The child was no longer alone, and together they began to build a future on the foundation of a promise kept